I'll tell you a bit more about Critical Collective at the end, but just let me tell you about our upcoming events. We have a recurring event called What's the Real Story, which is around the 20th of every month. And the next What's the Real Story event will take place on the 24th of April, and we'll consider Hugo Chavez and his legacy from different perspectives. I think that will be very interesting for you to attend. The next What's the Real Story event is about Papua. Probably only a few of you know that there is an independence struggle going on in the Papua, and that in the past years, well, tens of thousands, some even say hundreds of thousands of people have been the victim of corporate-led ethnic cleansing. Quite an interesting topic to think about. We will have on the 25th, next month, so the 25th of May, am I right? Where's Abu Hassan? Well, 25th of May, we'll have a What's the Real Story event. And the 24th of April, we have also about the Papua, a critical film and food night. This is also a recurring event. Every month we have an evening where we screen a critical documentary followed by an interesting discussion. And there is also food at these critical food. Yeah. Makes your stomach critical. If you want to know more about Critical Collective, make sure you fill in your name and your email on the mailing list. We lost the professional one, so we have to do with this one. I'll be passed around in a bit. And also have a look at our Facebook, facebook.com/Critical Collective. We have, I think, 10 events coming in the next 2 months. They're all perhaps interesting to you. Final thing about Critical Collective, there's a donation box. We are not funded by any official institution, and in order to be able to bring to you events like these, we do depend on your donation. So if you can spare a dime or more, please, that's the place where to put it. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Howard Nicholas, our speaker tonight. Professor Nicholas is Professor of Economics at this institution, and he won Best Lecturer Award 10 consecutive years. I in fact asked him, is it 9 or 10? He forgot about it. And what we will be talking about tonight is a critique of the dominant understanding of economics, which is Neoclassical economics. That's the dominant school of thought currently. Please join me in welcoming him after I tell you how the program is of tonight. He will speak for approximately an hour. We'll have a break. Then we'll be back where he'll speak just a bit more, and then we'll have a discussion, and you can ask questions that come to your mind or contest what he tells you. So, Howard Nicholas, the floor is yours.
I usually offer a reward of 500 euros to anyone who can guess where I'm from, and usually no one gets it. In fact, no one has ever gotten it. So I'm very safe. I'm from Sri Lanka. You'd never guess that, would you? Dutch descent. Okay, 300 years ago, Dutch settled there, Portuguese settled there, and we are the remnants. I always tell people I'm actually Sri Lankan. I feel Sri Lankan. I don't know what I'm doing in Holland, except I'm married to a Dutch woman, but, I tried to settle in Sri Lanka, but there was a civil war there, and so we had to come back. I mean, that's, in short, why I'm here. Because my heart is still in Sri Lanka, I have to tell everyone that. My feet are sometimes in other places, but my heart is always in Sri Lanka. So we got that out of the way. I have to tell my students that because usually I give them very good marks if they know when Sri Lanka won the Cricket World Cup and things like that. I'm an economist, but I'm ashamed to say I'm an economist, to be perfectly honest. And it's not because, they get everything wrong and so on, but really because I don't consider what we do any more economics. I don't know what it is. I think it's something like statistics, but I nowadays don't really recognize the economics profession. So that's the way I start. And that's also partly my excuse for not publishing very much anywhere, because I really don't understand what's in journals anymore either. The one thing that you also need to know about me is I invest money. I believe that basically if you know what you're doing, you know the markets. And to know economics, you really need to know the markets. This does not mean to say I'm passionately in love with the markets, far from it. But basically, this is what it's about. And this is partly what I think my profession does not do. And here's the thing. I lived and worked in Sri Lanka for 10 years. I set up a think tank for the government, and I set up a graduate faculty. And during that time, I saw many, many consultants come to Sri Lanka. Many. And they were paid enormous sums of money. Something like $2,500 a day over the period of 6 weeks. You know, this is an average. And what did they do? Well, basically bugger all. What they did was justify economic policies that the West wanted implemented in Sri Lanka. This is basically what they did. And for that, they got a lot of money. I used to ask many of them, I said, look, we're implementing everything you've told us to implement. Why don't you put some of your own money in our stock markets? Because surely now the economy is going to grow, you'll make lots of money. You think any of them did it? No. When an economist tells you, I know about currencies, you know, the dollar is going to do this, the euro is going to do that. Ask them, how much money have you put down on that I can believe you? And I don't want them to win every time, I just want them to feel the pain when they're wrong. But they don't do that. They simply don't do that. I think many of them, and this was my observation in Sri Lanka, a team came to Sri Lanka to advise us on the financial sector. Trust me, not one of that team, even though they published many books on financial markets and so on, actually knew what a financial market really did. You know? And that's the state of our profession today. We have academics that have absolutely zero knowledge of the real world. And that's precisely why we're in the mess we're in. And the sad news for you is don't rely on that generation, because they're not going to get you out of this mess. I'm a bit worried about your generation with the brainwashing that I see that's going on. My son is studying economics at Utrecht. And he says he can just about keep awake most of the classes. And when he asks a question, the teacher basically ignores him, you know, and goes on. He says, to be fair to the teacher, probably can't actually hear his question because there's so much chatter going on. No one really seems to be that interested anyway in what's going on. So I'm a bit worried about what we are actually having as the economics profession and economics teaching. And it's with that in mind that I have this little crusade of mine in the last years of my career to try and say some things about neoclassical economics, but not just be negative. I think there's actually no point in just being negative. These are bad guys, I'm a good guy. I mean, what's the point of that? Do you have an alternative is really more the point. Okay, and that's really what I like to do in what I'm about to do. First I do a hatchet job a little bit, and then I tell you, well, the hatchet job is not just criticizing for the sake of criticizing, but what are the crucial things that need to be looked at in order to build something, an alternative economics, let's say. Okay, an alternative, very practical economics. Now sometimes the things I tell people frighten them. I was just giving an anecdote. I think you were sharing that anecdote. 12 years ago, I gave a lecture at the University of Leiden. You must be the first non-developing country audience that I lecture to, because I don't normally lecture to anyone in the advanced countries. I think you have too many Nobel Prizes and very good academics and all the rest of it. So I don't bother here. But partly, actually, because I was aware from a very early stage that what I have to say is very frightening. And what I told students then, 12 years ago, is you have brainwashed our academics and policymakers in developing countries for years, but it's changing. Because we have the East Asian examples, we have China. They are doing things that are totally contrary to everything that was taught to them in the textbooks. There is not one single thing in any economics textbook that China has actually practiced which anyone can refer to as the basis for its success. And I told them that if you think China is the only one that's going to do it, you're sadly mistaken. All the developing countries, one by one, are going to learn the secret. And the result of that is you're going to lose the standard of living that you have always enjoyed in the West. And you will not enjoy what your parents enjoyed before you. That you will face a generation of unemployment. You know, the professor called me and he said it was a fascinating lecture. And I personally, he said, liked it. And I would have loved to invite you back, but the students would actually rebel. He said one student told me she had a nightmare that night. And she really saw herself without a job for a decade or more. Now look at the unemployment problems you're having today. And I'm going to tell you this, it hasn't begun yet. It really hasn't begun. And that's why those of you who know, I think there's only one person who knows my family, I advise my children, go east, study there, try and understand it. I was giving this lecture at Fudan University in China last year, and there's this guy waving from the back there, and I could tell the wave, you know, it's a Dutch wave. It's from Groningen. I said, what the hell are you doing here? He said, well, I'm doing what you have just told your sons to do. You know, I'm going to Asia to learn, because I don't think I'm going to get a job in Europe, not a sustainable job in the future. Okay, so this is the backdrop. Are you frightened? I don't want to frighten you. This is not an aim to frighten, this is the reality. Generally, people don't listen to me. Sometimes when I feel strongly, I decide I will go public and lecture. So, if any of you wish to see my YouTube videos from 2005 to 2007, I only traveled in the Caribbean and Sri Lanka and so on, telling them there's a big crisis coming. Do something. I give investment advice, I tell you, because it's very important, you see. There's no social security system in Sri Lanka. When the crisis hits, people lose their jobs, that's it, it's over. You know, they lose their lives. So I decided I have to go there, tell people things and so on. I boast about this because it's the only time I ever got anything right in my life. Okay, all the others are wrong. All my other predictions are wrong. Never listen to me about, you know, buy gold, sell dollar, or something like that, you know. So this was the only other time. And why I mention it is because I'm going to just explain to you why I believe that there was a crisis, why I think there is no euro crisis. Okay, there's actually only a euro future. Europe has the only possibility to challenge Asia. The US does not. And I will explain a little bit later why. Okay, and why last year I told all my friends, do not dump euros. Do not sell the euro. What did they do when I told them all this? I'm talking very rich people here, even in the Netherlands. They sold the euro like mad. You see, I told you, no one listens to me. You know? Anyway, okay, let me start now. Title. Problems with Neoclassical Economics. Ali gave it another title. Why I think Neoclassical Economics is an ideology. And basically, I try and put it into a nutshell. So neoclassical economics is what most of us have been taught. Okay, so some of you told me you're from Rotterdam. I know Rotterdam is one of the bastions of neoclassical economics in the Netherlands, so you will know all about it. But actually, it's very difficult to find non-neoclassical schools. Okay, it's not so easy. If you come to ISS, it's the same thing. We are by and large mostly neoclassical, but there are a few eccentric people who teach non-neoclassical. Why do I think it's an ideology? Well, fundamentally because everything about it aims to justify capitalism. Now, I don't have a problem with capitalism. Let me get that straight out. I think there are good aspects of capitalism, but also lots of bad aspects. If you ask me whether I want capitalism to continue, answer is no. Okay, I would prefer another type of society. But I don't have big issues with it. I don't want storming of the barricades and all the rest of it. Okay? I basically think that the problem with neoclassical economics, it is an ideological justification for capitalism. It's not a science. Okay? And that's what I intend to show. The reason for its existence is precisely to cover up the essence of what capitalism is about. Because the essence is fundamental inequality. Okay? The essence of capitalism is to create a large number of people who do not have anything else but their labor to sell. Okay? And a very small group that basically own most of the resources on the planet. Okay? So that's the essence of the system. And if we allow everyone to, let's say, have access to land, free access to credit, easy access to education, this is also important, then who wants to do the shit jobs? Nobody. Okay? Because I'll just go and borrow money and keep going. Or I'll go back to the farm, or I'll just go and take another degree. You see, those were good days for you when you could do that in the Netherlands. But remember, the change in the education system in the Netherlands is precisely because the West is losing the ability to live off the developing countries. Now we're going to turn on our own population here. And this means we have to have a small group that have access and privilege, and the majority cannot just get higher education. This is why Barma is introduced. It's not a nice reform to help everyone and so on. This is a competitive system where only a certain elite get to the top. This is the aim of that system. Okay? And what neoclassical economics tries to do is to hide this. And why it does that is because there was a previous economics called classical economics that had one focus: profits. It said profits dominates the whole economic universe. Okay? The whole system is driven by profits. Nothing else matters except for profits. Neoclassical economics tries to stop that because it's not a good idea, is it, to say that profits drives everything. We would rather like to say welfare. The needs of the people drives everything. Isn't that a nicer way to say it? Well, that's what neoclassical economics does. It says individual preferences, so that's the starting point of neoclassical economics, drives the whole system. That's why it replaced classical economics, because it's much more palatable for capitalists. You see, once I unmask everything and say, actually, nothing else matters for the allocation of resources except for profits, then I'm changing the whole way I look at economics. You see? Notice, you open your textbook. What's the first line in a textbook? What allocates resources? according to neoclassical economics, it's prices, isn't it? But it's not true. Prices allocate resources. It's never been true. I can have rising prices and falling profits. Do you think resources will go to that industry where the profits are falling even if prices are rising? No. I can have falling prices and rising profits. Capital will flow to that. You understand? In other words, what dominates the movement of resources everywhere on the planet? One thing, profits. Okay? It's not preferences. It has never been about preferences. But this is not really nice to say as the essence of our whole analysis. So it shifts the whole analysis away from profits, and it does a second thing which is very important. It blames government for everything. Okay? And that's also very important because capitalism has to erode the power of government from time to time. From time to time. Okay? It needs government to enforce laws which support private property. But it also needs government to move out and create spaces for capitalism. One of the current battlegrounds is education. You may not know it, but there's no way in which higher education is not going to be privatized in the next 10 years. Okay? We are now committed to privatization of higher education because the Europeans, like most countries, have signed up to the GATS. And higher education is number one on that signing up. So everything you see now, the restructuring, the commercialization, is part of that privatization. This is capitalism moving into areas where the state traditionally was. Okay, we see it in the prison services. We see it also in the military, don't we? The privatization of the military. Okay? And in order to justify all of that, we need neoclassical economics, which says government is always bad. Okay? It's always inefficient. So it's the repeated story, and I will come back to that in just a moment. Why I don't like it is not actually for altruistic reasons. But I'm a scientist and an investor. I actually want a proper vision of what's happening out there. I want to understand. I want to really know why this is happening and what is likely to happen next. And this is where I got thoroughly disillusioned with neoclassical economics, especially the variants that I learned, which were highly mathematical. I think you can't do neoclassical anymore without the maths and the stats and all the rest of the crap that goes with it. Okay, so let's briefly... How many of you have not done economics before? Okay, now the smart ones. Okay, so those are the ones who are really smart. I'm going to ask you all the questions. Okay.
No.
Okay, just...
I'm busy.
Don't worry, don't get nervous. You won't get me in the frame properly. Especially for those who don't know, who haven't studied economics before. Neoclassical economics emerges in the mid-19th century. And it's no coincidence that it emerges at a time of revolutionary movements in Europe. Okay, it emerges fundamentally in Europe, and it emerges at precisely that time to displace that classical economics that I spoke about. Now, we're confused nowadays with all sorts of different labels. I've given you the three major strongholds that used to exist up till about 2 or 3 years ago, but nowadays I'm informed that new strongholds have developed. But we have heard of new Keynesians, Walrusians, Austrians, New institutional economists, you've heard of those? Okay. Supply-siders, monetarists. You've heard new monetarists. You've heard all these terms, isn't it? They're all variants of neoclassical economics. There's also nowadays 3 fashion areas: behavioral economics, experimental economics, and game theory. Okay, all are derivatives of neoclassical economics. Actually, it is part of the disintegrating monolith. Because the monolith is disintegrating, it's spawning all sorts of odd entities that have virtually no coherence, no foundations, exist only to explain minuscule fragments of, I'm not even sure of the economy, but minuscule fragments of something or another. But these are basically still the big variants. And why I mention this is because today we are seeing new Keynesians coming to the fore. Ben Bernanke, you've heard of Ben Bernanke? He's a new Keynesian. But really, his heart is pure neoclassical. His idol is someone called Milton Friedman. You've all heard of Milton Friedman, isn't it? Chicago boys, very famous. Okay, so new Keynesians, Stiglitz, Krugman, they're all part of the same framework. They're not actually fundamentally different. The hardline loonies are basically the Walrasians and the Austrians. The Austrians are really the fanatics, you know, the Bible thumpers, if you like. Okay? They control most of the journals, the academic journals, especially the 5-star and 4-star are all mostly neoclassical with 1 or 2 exceptions. So if you want to get tenure at a university, if you want to get promoted, you better start learning some good neoclassical economics, because otherwise there's virtually no chance of you unless you get into a ghetto like the ISS. Okay? But apart from the ghetto like the ISS, and we are also disappearing because we're being integrated into Rotterdam. You know, we cannot have these subversive ghettos existing because we know how they develop and spawn unnecessary and unsavory characters. So we also have the international institutions. The hardliner is the IMF, we all know that. WTO as well, but a bit the soft belly is the World Bank. Sometimes it flirts a bit with new Keynesians and, you know, poverty this and poverty that and all the rest of it. Okay, but fundamentally they are neoclassical. And here is the most interesting thing, is that no non-neoclassical ever wins the Nobel Prize. Because it's not a Nobel Prize, you know that, don't you? It's not a real Nobel Prize. This is a fictitious Nobel Prize invented by the Rand Corporation together with the Swedish Central Bank in 1968. Read up about it. It was deliberately designed to promote neoclassical economists. And the Nobel Committee totally opposed this and don't want anything to do with it. But, you know, all the pomp and ceremony is there because the idea is to actually essentially pay all the servants who have served you well. So if you look at all the list of all these economists, there's not one proper non-neoclassical. The closest we came was a person called Amartya Sen. But for me, maybe not for others, Amartya Sen is fundamentally a neoclassical economist. Okay? He just does a little cosmetic thing on the side. Okay? But essentially what he has done is he has rationalized neoclassical thought in the area of poverty analysis. Okay? That's one of the reasons why he got it. But genuinely non-neoclassical great economists who are not on your reading list for sure have never been even considered for it, either at the time of them being alive or posthumously. One of the most famous of all is a man called Piero Sraffa. Anyone heard of Piero Sraffa? Unbelievable. Probably the greatest economist since Karl Marx. Okay, there's been no greater. I mean, Keynes is nothing. Keynes was frightened of Sraffa, you know that? Keynes would not have a debate in public if Sraffa was in the room. And Robinson, very famous economist, female economist, said, every time I entered the room and I saw Sraffa there, my knees wobbled like a small schoolgirl, because he was an incredible intellect. At a young age of 27, he destroyed neoclassical economics already, and that text is not in any of your reading lists. You know, the supply-demand thing, already gone in 1927. Should not be in any textbook. You read Sraffa's Laws of Return, 12 pages, you will laugh every time you see supply and demand analysis after that. Okay? It should not be there. Because he didn't think he finished the job, he wrote a small book, unfortunately very mathematical. I condemn him for that. In 1960, he wrote a book called Production of Commodities by Means of Commodities. After that, neoclassicals are very careful to use one very important word. The word is capital. There is no current definition of capital for neoclassical economics. Now, understand how important this is. We're studying capitalism, but there's no definition of capital. How about that? You know, that's quite remarkable, isn't it? And this is why we have all the maths. You see, when I want to tell lies and use bullshit, the way I do it is with maths. Because I write tons of equations on the board, and then I take partial derivatives and make an equilibrium solution. My God, your head is going. It's like you're tripping on LSD or something. You don't question the person, do you? That guy must be a genius. You know, you have Einstein and the guy who's writing all those equations next to each other. You see, psychologically, you're done for. But you should ask the question, wait, what's the definition of capital you're using? Deadly silence, you see. The person will keep writing the equations on the board. They can't answer. Okay? There are many things like this we will come back to. These are very simple tricks if you want to... No, I shouldn't tell you that. I think that we should cut that bit out, you know. I'm not telling them to ask you what capital is in all your lectures. Okay, but anyway, I did tell one of my student from 4 years back, she didn't believe me, which I like. I love it when people don't believe me, because then we have a dialogue, you know, otherwise students are passively accepting everything. I utter more and more rubbish, and they're still accepting it, you know. But she challenged me. I don't believe this, because her father is a dean of Faculty of Economics, you see. And I don't believe this, so I'm going to do a research paper on this concept. Sheepishly, 1 month into the research, she said, my God, you're right. You know, I'm reading, I shouldn't mention that, Gregory Mankew's textbook, and in the space of one chapter, he has 3 different definitions of capital. I'm reading an article by such and such. In the space of 1 paragraph, they actually have 2 different definitions of capital. Think to yourself, capital. Human capital, you heard of that? Social capital, you heard of that? Natural capital, you heard of that? Money capital, are we getting there yet? You know? What are all the other capitals we can think of? Goes on and on and on. You see, we invent new definitions of capital every so often. Why? Because we actually do not know what capital is. Why is that? It's because of the ideological shift to neoclassical. And I will come back to that to explain why they had to do it. No, let me do it now. Shall I do it now? Otherwise you lose it out of your head, don't you? Here's the thing, that in the classical tradition, they explain profits by the struggle between one group and another group, workers and bosses. Okay? Whoever was more powerful would get a bit bigger share. Bosses were much more powerful, therefore they could get big profits. Okay? They had the state backing them. Neoclassical economics does not like this. We do not want to have struggle as explaining profits. We do not want exploitation explaining profits. So how do we explain profits and wages? Your own preferences for work and your productivity. You understand the point? Is that now, if you are poor, whose fault is it? Is it the boss's fault? It's your fault. You're not productive. And you have chosen leisure. You don't want to work. Now, in order to show this, you see, I have to have a definition of labor which is separate from capital. Capital which is separate from labor. Remember, capital gets profits on the basis of its productivity. So therefore, capital must be something separate from labor. But when a business starts activity, it has a sum of money. We call that capital, don't we? With that capital, they buy machines, don't they? But they also pay for labor. So there's no separation, you understand? There can't be a separation. Capital means the money I use to buy the machines as well as the labor. No separation. If there's no separation, I cannot talk of the productivity of capital. You know all your growth theory? Marginal productivity of capital and marginal productivity of labor, separate. But actually, in the real world, you cannot make them separate. It's not possible. Okay? And that's where the fundamental problem arises for neoclassical economics. That they know in the real world, capital is what we use to buy everything. And the return the capitalists get is the profit. They get a profit by paying workers less than the value of what they produce. That's how they get their profit. But neoclassical economics will not accept that. It has to hold the line and say, capital is rewarded according to its physical productivity, but that's where the problems start. They cannot measure that. It's impossible for them. They firstly cannot define capital, and secondly, they cannot measure its productivity. Okay, so that's why you get all this total factor productivity rubbish in growth theory. Okay, it's because they haven't got a concept of capital. Okay, so that's my plea for Sraffer. I'll be selling Sraffer's books after this class, okay? Okay, so just briefly then we go into how they see the economy, individuals, businesses. Individuals basically buy commodities to live. And they do it with money. And they get the money by selling services to the businesses. The services we call factor services. And usually these are three: labor, capital, land. Okay, those three. Remember, problem of capital is already there from the very beginning. And when neoclassical economics analyzes, they start with the analysis of the commodities market, the buying and selling of commodities, the factor markets. The two together we call microeconomics. The product markets and the factor markets. How do they work? Why do we pay the prices we pay? And why is it that workers get this wage and not that wage? Why is it we have this level of employment and not that level of employment? Why is that? Okay, so that's what we discuss in microeconomics. We put it all together and bring government in. We call that macroeconomics, all the markets together. And we study growth in the economy, inflation, balance of payments. Okay, those are the big things. Crises. And then the way we do it as neoclassical economists, we use a number of key concepts. And I'll just briefly mention these concepts. We don't go into them in detail unless you want me to. Private property. The meaning of this is everyone has the right in a private property system to own assets and get the income from owning those assets. So I can own a factory and get the profits. In a socialist system, you can't do that. Okay? It's a free market system, meaning that anyone who wants to produce anything they want to can do so and sell it, and anyone who wants to buy anything can do so. And the result of the buyers and sellers interacting with each other gives us prices of products. Competitive environment means lots of producers producing goods, not one, which is a monopoly, not a few, which is an oligopoly, but many. And that's an ideal environment. And then the last two is free trade and free capital flows. Very important definition. Free trade means no impediment to imports or exports. No promoting exports, in other words. So, when people say China has built its economy on free trade, of course this is nonsense, because China is one of the most aggressive promoters of its exports and blockers of imports that it does not want. Okay? You always like to claim success stories as part of your own theoretical framework, so people claim that China is a free trade country. And free capital flows means that I do not interfere with anyone taking money out of the country or bringing it back in for whatever purposes. Okay, just a few definitions. It's not the important point. This is the important point. The basic conclusions. If we have a private property, free market, competitive system, allowing free trade and free flow of capital, we will have the best world possible. We will have maximum welfare for everyone. Everyone will be the happiest you can possibly be. We will have a distribution of income where everyone will be rewarded according to their productivity and their preferences. So if you're productive, you get a higher wage. If you choose to invest in education, you get a higher wage. You see, get the point? That's, if I choose to save my money, you don't, I get more money. Okay? So distribution of what we produce is according to productivity and preferences. Highest growth rate possible. Stable growth. No unemployment. Are you listening to what I'm saying? No unemployment. How about that one? Are you going to elect me as president? I mean, I come with this manifesto. See all these goodies that I can deliver to you. Did I say no inflation? Well, let me throw in no inflation. No balance of payments problem. You think this is a mythical world? Well, it's the reality of neoclassical economics, ladies and gentlemen. So, who is the villain here? the government. If we have a crisis, whose fault is it?
Government.
If we have low growth, whose fault is it? Government. Inflation, who prints money? Government.
Wow.
Unemployment? Government. Holland losing a football match? Must be government, somewhere in there. Okay, now think of your textbooks. Those of you who've done economics, you notice chapter after chapter, the aim of the exercise is to show if markets work, everything is perfect. Everyone is happy. But if something stops the working of the market, and it can be Saddam Hussein or Hugo Chavez, okay, but usually it's governments, then things go bad. But if the market is allowed to work, you get all those wonderful results. Okay, so that's the basic message. And just to make sure you get the message, we call the government a rentier state. Okay, a rentier state. Now this is important. Those of you who have done economics will know this is new institutional economics, a predator state. Why we need to keep the state out is because they come and take our money all the time. Why do they do that? Because they're stuffing their own pockets with it. You notice this idea is the state is not a representative of capitalist class. No, no, no. It's representing themselves. So Angela Merkel is ripping off the Greeks and the Cypriots for her own pockets, you see. She's not doing it for the German business groups and the bankers of France and so on. No, 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 she wouldn't be doing that. She's doing it for her own pockets, you know. You can see she's looking a bit stouter these days. She must be eating more pizzas with all that money that she's taking. Okay, so that's their idea, because they want you to know that the government is a villain. Now, why this is especially important in developing countries, you see, if I want to destroy a country, I get you to think that your government is the villain. Because once your government does not interfere, then I can easily prey on your resources. Okay? It's strong governments that have always been vital in development, which is why advanced countries hate strong governments in developing countries. They're always the villains, the strong governments. Okay? You remember Mahathir in Malaysia. Even some mad bugger like Lee Kuan Yew was considered, you know, oh, he's a lunatic and so on and so forth. Strong governments are vital for developing countries. So what we do is we bring developing country students here and we brainwash them with neoclassical economics. They go back and say, oh, the villain is the government. Okay, we must get rid of government from everything. Not realizing that no country has ever developed without a strong government. But I always tell Western people this. You think ideology stops at the border, think again. All this stuff you have done to destroy governments in developing countries has now come home to the Netherlands. Look at your own public administration. Some of you may be as old as me. Remember the public service in the Netherlands 25 to 30 years ago. Compare it with the Netherlands public service today. It's a shambles. It's a shambles. Because we've run down public service in developing countries, but now that same ideology is infecting everything here. And this is destructive for all societies. Okay, so neoclassical economics, this last part has been very, very damaging. Now what I do is just a couple of slides and then we're finished with the first part. Why I don't like neoclassical economics, the general problems. I've already told you, aim of the exercise is to sanitize capitalism. Okay? And what I mean by that is capitalism is built on inequality. You need inequality. It's impossible to survive without inequality. Capitalism needs unemployment. There's no way capitalism can survive without unemployment. Why? Because when people are unemployed, you discipline the workers. This is the essence of unemployment. Now, at the moment, you have two disciplines on Western workers. If you don't behave here, we're taking business to the developing countries. You've heard it now many times, isn't it? Accept lower wages or we're going. Well, traditionally, the way we do it is unemployment, inequality. This is fundamental to the system. I just ask you this. Think carefully. We're cutting expenditure on schools. We're cutting expenditure on health